Good morning, class. So we are going to start our discussion of evolution and genetics. And we are going to begin by talking about evolution and then move into genetics on Wednesday. So when we talk about evolution, we're referring to the change in the frequency of various genes in a population over generations. And this happens regardless of whether the change is helpful or harmful to the species. Evolution isn't always better. And again, it isn't always to the benefit of the species. And when we talk about evolution, we're really attempting to answer two questions. One of them is, how did some species evolve? We're going to talk a little bit about the evolution of humans. And how do species evolve? So what is the mechanism by which evolution happens? And how did some of the species evolve? So when we talk about how species evolve, it rests upon some assumptions. If you look at offspring, they generally resemble their parents in some way for genetic reasons. We can look at facial expressions, and there is a commonality in facial expressions between parent and offspring. So there must be a genetic contribution or a degree of heritability of facial expressions from parent to offspring. And this is a genetic influence. Mutations, changes in the genetic material, recombination, and microduplications of genes introduce new heritable variations. And again, the passing on of genetic material from parent to offspring. And certain individuals successfully reproduce more than others. So you may have heard this phrase in relationship to evolution, that it's about survival of the fittest. It's really, fitness refers to the amount that a species reproduces. So it's not really about length of survival per se. It's about survival to the point of reproduction and then the ability to reproduce more. Those species or organisms the organisms within a species that reproduce more will propagate their genetic material. And that will spread into the gene pool. So again, certain individuals are more successful in reproduction, and that's called fitness. And so evolution isn't really affected by length of lifespan, survival in general. It's really about being able to survive through reproductive years and reproduce more than other organisms within your species. Okay, so Darwin, developing the theory of evolution, presented three kinds of evidence. So there is the fossil record. So we see that throughout time, there are changes within the fossil record. And here you can see the shift in the hominid skull over time. And later we'll talk more about the evolution of Homo sapiens, of humans. And we'll talk about that in terms of brain change or brain growth size. He also presented structural similarities. So if we look at the wing of a bat and the arm of a human, there are structural similarities among these two living species, which are diverse. There are what are called homologous structures and analogous structures. Here we see that the arm of a human and the wing of a bird or a bat, the leg of a dog and the flipper of a dolphin or whale. These are bones that appear in different animals, but the underlying anatomical commonalities demonstrate that they descend from a common ancestor. Whereas analogous structures, they're similar in function. So the function could be flying, but we have a wing of a fly, the wing of a moth, and a bird. They developed independently. They don't have a common ancestor, but they have a common function, which is flying. So it's a superficial resemblance of these structures. They have different origins. So you may ask yourself, why is it that multiple species without a common ancestor develop this ability to fly? And it has to do with they may be different species, but the environment and the challenges in the environment are similar. And so organisms have to come up with a way of solving challenges presented by the environment. So even the human being, why we develop social behaviors are to solve environmental challenges. We needed to work together in groups in order to take advantage of the resources and get access to resources, right? It's easier to hunt in groups or to help each other survive than it is to do that in isolation. Or something as, seemingly simple as walking upright. We evolved to walk upright to solve environmental challenges. As the temperature was changing and there was more, it became savanna and there were grasslands and there was a further distance for human beings to traverse and having to deal with temperature, it was advantageous to walk upright. There's less of your body's surface area exposed to the sun, as well as being able to traverse that landscape with conserving energetic resources. So fossil records, structural similarities, and selective breeding. So we're most familiar with selective breeding, sometimes called artificial selection, when we talk maybe about racehorses or we talk about different breeds of dogs. We selectively take dogs of different breeds and have them mate so that they are best fit to some sort of environmental challenge, but that environmental challenge is kind of put there for human beings, right? So if we want to go bird hunting, right, we need to breed a dog who will be able to go and retrieve our kill for us. So we set this environmental challenge and then purposefully breed the dogs to be best fit for a particular job. But again, what you're doing is you are taking the best of one breed and this other breed, and you are shuffling or combining their genetic material so it will most likely exhibit a trait that you are particularly concerned with. So again, selective breeding, sometimes called artificial selection, refers to choosing individuals with desired traits and making them parents of the next generation. Now, according to Darwin, nature also selects, and successful individuals' genes will be prevalent in later generations. So, as opposed to artificial selection, Darwin argued that evolution happens due to natural and sexual selection. Again, those with fitness, the ability to reproduce more, will spread their genetic material into the gene pool. Now, there are some common misconceptions about evolution, one being Lamarckian evolution. Lamarckian evolution argues that the use or disuse of some structure or behavior causes an increase or decrease in that behavior. So if one works out more and grows really big muscles, their offspring will just be born with big muscles. And that's not exactly how this works. Now, we'll talk about epigenetics more in the next chapter. And there is a difference between your experience turning on and off genes, so they exhibit their effects or not, and this idea of whether or not something is used or disused. Usually it has to, a behavior provides some sort of adaptive advantage, but it doesn't necessarily have to in order to propagate into the gene pool. Another misconception is that humans have stopped evolving, and that evolution means improvement. Like I said, some genetic mutations could actually be harmful to the individuals, maybe in terms of length of lifespan, length of survival. However, there's a fitness advantage. That doesn't necessarily mean improvement per se. And evolution acts to benefit the individual or the species. That is a misconception of evolution. If you ever get a chance to read Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, he is a scientist and also an incredible writer who talks about this idea that that genes work, evolution works at the level of the genes, not at the level of the individual or an entire species. And again, whatever is going to allow that piece of genetic material to propagate into the population is what is going to exist in generations to come. Again, that may be overall beneficial or overall harmful to the individual or the species, but evolution really happens at the level of the gene. Evolution does not proceed in a single line. We often think of how there's just one common ancestor, and then there are these changes that just happen linearly over generations, but there are actually branches of species, and some are more successful than others, right? We share a common ancestor with Neanderthals, for instance, and we actually still share some genetic material of the Neanderthals, but our primary line was more successful, and there were several other branches involved in human evolution. Rapid evolutionary changes do occur. A great example of this is the Darwin's finches, and how they had beaks that were shaped to take advantage of the primary food resources on whatever Galapagos Island they were sequestered to. Interestingly, fewer than 1% of all known species are still in existence. And evolution does not necessarily result in perfect design, right? It's a good enough solution to an evolutionary challenge that was developed based on the material that had already been present in generations previous. So it's important to note that not all existing behaviors or structures are adaptive. Spandrels are incidental, non-adaptive byproducts, such as the human belly button. So the belly button itself, its shape, its structure, its existence does not provide an adaptive advantage. However, it is a result of having an umbilical cord, which does provide that adaptive advantage. Not all existing adaptive characteristics evolved to perform their current function. So these are called acceptations. It's evolved to do one thing, but now does something else. So goosebumps are an excellent example of this. Goosebumps are a leftover mechanism for when we had more hair. Having goosebumps and this ability for the hair to stand up on end will make an organism look bigger and more threatening or to a potential predator. However, we still experience goosebumps, but we don't need to do that for that particular purpose, as we are much less hairy than our common ancestors and the apes. And now we just get to experience goosebumps to cool things like music, or when you're frightened of something. Okay, and humans are not the product of a single ancestral population from Africa. Okay, so behaviors also contribute to fitness. And there are some obvious examples of behaviors that will help us to survive and be able to reproduce. And that's finding food, avoiding predation. But not so obvious examples are things like social dominance and courtship displays or mate behavior. And another example of a not so obvious behavior that possibly evolved to contribute to fitness is altruism or reciprocal altruism, which we'll talk more about in a moment. But that is just generally altruistic behaviors are doing for other members of the species with risk to oneself, right? So if you think about the fireman who runs into a burning building to save a cat or another human being, but could quite possibly die during that activity or that behavior. You could also think of squirrels or other mammals who let out alarm calls when they see a predator overhead, right? That alarm call will alert that predator to where that member of the species is. However, they do that to alert other members of the species that there's a predator there. So we'll talk about how that can possibly contribute to fitness, even though that behavior could potentially be detrimental to the individual organism. Again, evolution is less concerned about the individual or the entire species, but we'll talk about that in a bit. So let's look at evolution condensed. Okay, we're going to start with evolution of vertebrates. So as you could see, chordates and have a spinal cord and a brain and a spinal cord like human beings do, unlike non-chordate species. Vertebrates, which we also are, have spinal bones as well. Here you could see the brains and central nervous system of other species that are part of our evolutionary tree in some way. Here you can see the cerebrum and how that is shaped and sized differently between other species and us. So the biggest shift that we see is really the size of these areas that make up the central nervous system. Okay, so evolution of amphibians. There were bony fish that leave the water. The advantages were the ability to move from one area of water to move to another area, which was fresh, more oxygenated water, and there were new food sources. From there, we see the evolution of reptiles. They will lay shell-covered eggs. They can live far from water because now the water environment is inside the shell-covered eggs. So they're able to move further from bodies of water. Evolution of mammals. From there, mammals develop mammary glands to nurture young. Again, the liquid or watery environment is now, instead of outside of the body in a shell, it is inside of the body. Again, the young is raised inside of the mother's body, and also the source of nutrients to nourish the young is part of the mother's body. Humans emerge from the order of primates, and human beings belong to a family of hominids and of the genus Homo. And the first Homo species emerged from the Australopithecus approximately 4 million years ago. Homo sapiens emerged 275,000 years ago. And it's thought that the marcation of our species, and separate from other hominid species, is the development of our brain and our ability to use tools. So here we see the skull size and shape of the Australopithecus. As you can see, it looks quite chimp-like. We share a common ancestor with other primates. Here we see further along in the chain of our evolution, a shift in the size and shape of the skull. You can even see there are changes in the dentures and the teeth structure. And here we see the skull of a modern human. And you can see how much larger it is, how the teeth have changed to deal with our diet. Diet is thought to have an impact on the size and shape of our brain. So the human brain has increased in size during evolution, and the increase in size has occurred mostly in the cerebrum. And we've talked about this area quite a bit most of this semester, right? And you can see the difference in size, right, from these separate species, right? And what allows our cerebrum to be so large and not really, it did change the size and shape of the skull, right? But the larger that our skull becomes, the more difficult it is to birth ahead of that size, which was one of the challenges for Neanderthals. There would have been, with larger skull size, there's more bleeding and damage to the mother during the birthing process. If the mother dies during that process, there's no nutrients and nutrition or care for the offspring. So there has to be a balance between the size of the skull and the birthing canal. And again, the size of the brain is going to contribute to the size of the skull. So we see all these grooves and folds so that we can pack more surface area into the smaller skull. So the convolutions allow an increase in volume of the cerebral cortex. So brain size, right, and this is the brain size of different species, is not correlated with intelligence. The size of the brain is correlated with the size of the body. So we actually find that if you look at the difference in brain size between genetic males and genetic females, the brain size of genetic males is larger. That's just because it's correlated with the size of the body. It's actually the convolutions that lead to a larger cerebrum. And again, there's this relationship between the cerebrum and intelligence. It's the relative sizes of different brain regions that are important. And for intelligence, the cerebrum is related. Okay, so one of the explanations for the ability of human beings to evolve a brain of our size is the fuels that it needs. Remember, glucose is the primary source for the brain. Our ancestors managed to get enough nutrition. We began cooking food, which made it easier to digest, easier to extract nutrients. Group hunting was more efficient, and humans have better capacity for glucose transport. Now, our evolutionary desire to consume sugar because it tastes good, right? It tastes good because it's a dense calorie package. Things that are sweet taste good because that is a sign that there are nutrients there for our brain. Glucose is the primary nutrient. However, in a time where we have access to more food more regularly, sugar has actually become something that it's deleterious, right? So the area of our brain that is responsive when we eat sugar, we get a reward signal when we eat sugar. And so we keep eating it and keep eating and keep eating it because it's so readily available. Things have become even sweeter than, vegetables and fruits of our evolutionary history. And it's led to some issues of obesity and diabetes and so on and so forth. So something that can be beneficial at one time may not be so beneficial in our current time based on other factors, environmental factors. Now, the subdiscipline of psychology, evolutionary psychology, is looking at this relationship between genes and cognitive functions. So our brains, the development of our brains is coded for by our genetic material, right? And there's nothing other than genes that build our brains. And cognition, our thoughts, our judgments, our decisions, our actions is dependent on the brain, right? Our behavior is mental activity. right? And there's nothing else other than brains that think. So if cognition is dependent on the brain and the brain is coded for by genes, then there is this relationship that exists between genes and cognitive functions. And so evolutionary psychology is looking at cognitions and behaviors as it relates to the process of evolution. So natural and sexual selection should be discernible in cognitive function. So let's just take the behavior of creativity, for example, which is, a cognition. It's a thought process. It's a thought process. And the question would be, does creativity as a human cognition provide some sort of evolutionary advantage? Do we see common ancestors that have displayed some form of creativity? Right? So what is its function? What purpose does it serve? Does it have an evolutionary advantage? And where in our evolution did this behavior exhibit itself? Do we see this in the branches of our family tree? Okay, so evolutionary psychology again focuses upon functional and evolutionary explanations of how behaviors evolved, right? What's its function, and where in the process of evolution do we see this behavior exhibit? And it assumes that behaviors, characteristics of a species have arisen through natural selection and again provide a survival advantage. I used creativity, but other examples, differences in peripheral color vision. We saw in Brian Lado's talk about why our ability to see color is a survival advantage. Sleep mechanisms, eating habits, temperature regulation, right? I talked earlier about how temperature regulation is one of the driving factors for human beings to be able to walk upright. Being able to walk upright and freeing our hands from use of walking or swinging through branches allows our hands to be used for different purposes, like holding young or shaping tools, hunting, which allowed for the development of our brains. Some behaviors are more debatable with regard to the influence of natural selection. So the lifespan length, this is a behavior that is of interest to evolutionary psychologists, right? So if after menopause, right, if evolution is concerned with fitness, right, keeping the organism alive through reproductive period, why don't people's lifespans just end right after their reproductive years, right? Why do we see grandmothers? Why do we see women over the age of whenever menopause happens in 50s? There are theories about how a longer lifespan could be advantageous, again, at the genetic level. Okay. Read Richard Dawkins. The Selfish Gene is an incredible, well-written book that explains this in length if you're interested. Gender differences in sexual promiscuity. So we're actually going to talk in a moment about mate selection and mating behaviors, as well as altruism in terms through the lens of evolutionary psychology, right? So these are three behaviors that are challenging for evolutionary psychologists to explain in terms of survival and reproductive advantages, but there are theories that capture them through this lens. Okay. So again, let's look at things at the level of the gene. Okay, the gene only spreads if individuals with it reproduce more than individuals without it. And that benefits the species, but not the individual, because it will die out with that individual. So if we look at altruism, okay, as a function of the gene, at the level of the gene, right? Reciprocal altruism is this idea that individuals that help others will have that returned as a favor. And why would that be advantageous? If I help somebody else, they'll help me. There's actually this argument that we developed the ability to recognize faces as a way to establish these reciprocal relationships. They call them tit for tat relationships. And again, if I make myself a helpful member of a community, not only when I am in need of help, I will get those helping behaviors reciprocated, but I also build a reputation for myself that elevates my status within a social hierarchy. This reputation only works if others are willing to cooperate with you. Our society is mostly cooperative. There are individuals that, they're called cheats, and they will come in and take advantage of people's altruistic behaviors by not returning those favors. However, unless that cheat moves to different communities, that reputation will build and people will stop helping that individual, most likely push them out of the community. So altruism and reciprocal altruism keeps one in the safety of an in-group. It often elevates status. Even vampire bats will they will collect enough blood to feed themselves, and they'll go back to the cave, and they will feed another member of their species that lives in that cave. And that's a form of reciprocal altruism in species that's not human beings, right? So vampire bats do it too. They'll share their blood. And they've done studies, and they have shown that those who do share their night's meal will have that returned. So that's reciprocal altruism. I want to talk about altruistic behaviors that aren't as obviously reciprocated, that also put the individual of the species in risk of being harmed, like the firefighter who runs into the burning building, or the squirrel that calls out an alarm. What they note is that that actually, when individuals of these species throw out their alarm calls, the other individuals surrounding that are alerted by these calls are actually members of a kin unit. And so in essence, if you draw attention to yourself as a squirrel making an alarm call, if you draw that kind of attention to you, and the prey is able to direct itself at you, you have saved a kin unit that also has the same genetic material as you, so that it can still spread or propagate through the species, through through mating and natural selection. And so we take this idea that early on in evolutionary history, altruism as a behavior got its footing through kin selection. We can see how this behavior would then propagate into the environment. And from kin groups, we have moved into groups that we are closely related to that aren't quite kin. But this behavior of altruism is spread far that it still elicits itself within these less related groups. But it has its foothold due to kin groups. And again, these groups that become tribes or societal units, they are made up of some kin, but they are also made up of other individuals who have agreed implicitly to be in this reciprocal altruistic relationship. Okay. And we can also talk about, I would rather say it as sex differences and sexual promiscuity as opposed to gender differences. But we can see examples of this as well. And if we look at it in terms of cost and benefit to the individuals, and we think about the amount of resources that is invested very early on in offspring as a difference between the sexes, it helps us understand differences in sexual promiscuity. This is a controversial topic. The research, however, over the years, and some could be biased, have shown that genetic males tend to be more promiscuous than genetic females. And the argument is really at the level of the sex cell, okay? The difference between males and females at the level of the sex cells is simply females only have a particular amount of eggs. And if one of these eggs becomes fertilized, that egg is not only the first bit of nutrient for that developing zygote, that is a 9-month commitment of energetic and nutrient resources from inside of the body, let alone the female is the source of food and nutrients for that developing newborn and infant for several years after birth. So the amount of resources that is invested in an offspring between females and males is different at the level of the sex cell, right? Males, on the other hand, can produce copious amounts of sperm, and they can do so much further into their lifespan than females can. So again, with this, it's not a costly investment at the genetic level for males in terms of reproduction. And so the argument is that the commitment, the resources, that length of an effort in the resources inform their level of sexual promiscuity. Okay, so there is some behaviors through the lens of evolutionary psychology. The next time we talk, we are going to talk about genetics. While Darwin was developing his theory of evolution, he wasn't quite sure what the mechanism of heritability is. At the same time, Darwin was working on his theory of evolution. Gregor Mendel was looking at his studies on genetics by working with pea plants. And we'll talk about why he chose to use pea plants as his subject. But you know, genetics is the mechanism of evolution, right? It's the genes, the genetic material that is going to propagate throughout the population. And it's the genetic material that is going to code for the proteins that become the brain, the neurons, the axons, other parts of the body, right? And the brain is what produces cognitions and behavior. So we'll get to that next time. Okay, thank you. Hope you're all doing well.